A monster storm out in the middle of the Pacific just stalled out for a moment, and that pause is actually the calm before it explodes into one of the strongest typhoons we've seen all year. Today is Wednesday, the 29th of July 2026, and I want to walk you through exactly what Typhoon Dolphin is doing right now, where it's actually headed, and just as important, where it is not headed. Because there's a lot of noise out there making it sound like every island in the Pacific is in the direct path. Well, that's simply not the full picture, and I want to give you the real one. This has already been a genuinely active season out in the Western Pacific, and Dolphin is shaping up to be one of the more talked about storms of the year so far. We've already seen a couple of extremely powerful systems earlier this summer, so when I say Dolphin has the potential to rival or even top some of those earlier storms, I don't say that lightly. This particular part of the Pacific has been unusually productive this year, with several storms already reaching the very top end of the intensity scale well before we even reach the traditional peak of the season. Let's get into exactly what the data is showing right now. Let's start with where things stand at this exact moment. Dolphin has been sitting out in the open ocean, roughly a few hundred miles southeast of Wake Island, moving west-northwest at a fairly modest pace, somewhere around 9 miles an hour. Right now, we're looking at sustained winds close to 145 miles an hour, with gusts pushing up toward 175. That already puts it firmly in violent typhoon territory. But here's the interesting part. And over the past several hours, the storm actually went through something called an eye wall replacement cycle. This happens when a storm's inner eye wall starts breaking down and a new one forms around it. And during that transition, a storm will often briefly weaken or plateau before roaring back even stronger once the new eye wall fully takes over. That's exactly what we're watching play out with Dolphin right now. It looked absolutely stunning on satellite a little earlier with a tight little pinhole eye, and then that eye wall cycle kicked in and knocked it down a notch temporarily. For anyone less familiar with how these cycles actually work, think of it almost like the storm briefly reorganizing its own internal structure. The original tight inner eye wall essentially gets starved of the energy it needs to sustain itself, while a wider ring of thunderstorms forms around it and gradually takes over as the storm's new primary engine. And during that handoff, the storm typically loses a bit of its peak intensity. Sometimes the eye itself becomes obscured or ragged looking on satellite for a stretch. But once that new, larger eye wall fully consolidates, storms often come out the other side even stronger than before, assuming the surrounding environment stays supportive. Given how warm the water is out ahead of Dolphin right now, all the signs point toward exactly that kind of outcome here. Do not let that temporary pause fool you, though. The forecast models are calling for continued intensification, and we're talking about winds potentially reaching somewhere in the range of 155 knots within the next 3 days. For anyone who doesn't think in knots, that translates to serious Category 5, super typhoon territory. The reason forecasters are so confident about this continued strengthening comes down to the water Dolphin is moving over. We're looking at a massive stretch of ocean sitting at around 30 to 31 degrees Celsius, sitting directly in the storm's path. That's about as warm as it gets out there, and warm water is basically jet fuel for a tropical system like this. Combine that with generally low wind shear, meaning there isn't much in the way of competing upper-level winds trying to tear the storm apart, and you have just about ideal conditions for Dolphin to explode right back into a full-blown super typhoon over the next several days. Now, let's talk about where this thing is actually going, because this is the part everyone really wants to know. As of right now, Dolphin is expected to hold on to that general west-northwest track for the next 4 days or so, staying out over open water the entire time. It's being steered along the southwestern edge of a large ridge of high pressure sitting over the central North Pacific. Later in that forecast window, a trough of low pressure sitting up near the Kuril Islands is expected to weaken, which will allow that subtropical ridge to build in further to the north. When that happens, it should nudge Dolphin onto more of a westward track by around day 5. I want to spend a moment explaining why that steering pattern actually matters so much for a storm like this. Tropical systems generally don't have much steering power of their own. They largely just go wherever the surrounding large-scale weather pattern pushes them, kind of like a leaf floating on a river current. Right now, that ridge of high pressure to the north is acting like a wall, keeping Dolphin locked onto a fairly steady west-northwest heading. Once that wall starts to weaken and shift, the storm's path can bend fairly significantly, which is exactly the kind of turn we're watching for later in the forecast period. Here's the genuinely good news, at least for now. Based on the current track, Dolphin looks like it's going to stay well clear of Guam and the northern Mariana Islands, passing considerably to the northeast of them, rather than running directly over them. I know there are a lot of other channels and pages out there that make it sound like literally every single storm system is bearing down on every single island at once, and I want to be straight with you. That's simply not accurate here. Based on everything we're seeing right now, unless there's a meaningful shift in the pattern, Dolphin should not be making a direct run at the northern Marianas or Guam. Could that change? Sure, it always could, this far out. But right now, the data is pointing to a path that stays to the northeast of those islands by a solid margin. Where the real uncertainty lives is much further down the road, once Dolphin gets closer to Japan. Right now, the guidance is genuinely split. Some of the model ensembles are starting to lean toward the storm eventually targeting southwestern Japan, areas like Shikoku or Kyushu, potentially putting it in the neighborhood of some of the military installations out that way. Other model runs keep the door open for a track that continues further west, potentially threatening parts of China instead. We are still more than a week out from any of that actually happening, and a lot can shift in that amount of time. But for anyone who pays attention to typhoon season, this is genuinely one of the more interesting storms to watch develop, because of just how much room it still has to intensify. It's also worth remembering just how much uncertainty naturally builds up the further out in time a forecast reaches. A track forecast for tomorrow or the next day tends to be genuinely reliable. A track forecast for a week or more from now is still useful, but it should be treated more as a general area of concern than a precise line on a map. That's exactly why I keep saying we have time here. Nobody along that stretch of southern Japan needs to be making any decisions today based on a forecast this far out. What they do need is to keep paying attention as the picture sharpens up over the coming days. As those official agencies get more data from reconnaissance flights and updated satellite passes, that cone of uncertainty around the eventual landfall point, if there even is one, should start narrowing considerably. Let me give you a clearer sense of the intensity trend here. Looking 2 days out, we're expecting Dolphin to be sitting somewhere in strong Category 2 to Category 3 range as it continues that intensification process. From there, the trend keeps pointing upward, and not only is it expected to keep strengthening, but it's expected to hold on to that strength for a while rather than just spiking briefly and falling back down. Eventually, as the storm gets closer to Japan, it will start moving over cooler water. And that typically works against a storm's intensity, so there's a reasonable chance we see some weakening in that final stretch, especially if increased wind shear starts affecting the storm structure as it curves northward. But that's still down the road. Right now, the trend is unmistakably upward. I also want to be clear that we have a long runway to track this system, which is honestly the good news buried inside all of this. Dolphin is still way out there in the open Pacific, which gives us plenty of time to watch how the track evolves and update you well before anything changes in a meaningful way. So let's talk about the islands sitting in the general vicinity, because even small islands matter here, and I never want to gloss over that. Across the Mariana Islands, we're keeping a close watch, along with the smaller island clusters scattered around that region. Based on the current west-northwest heading, by the time we get deeper into Thursday, Dolphin is expected to be intensifying rapidly, potentially approaching super typhoon status within just a couple of days. We are watching all of the islands positioned out ahead of this track closely, and the hope is that the storm threads the needle and stays out over open water as much as possible as it lifts up and makes its closest approach to the general Mariana region. Based on the current heading, assuming nothing shifts, it should stay off to the northeast by a comfortable margin. For residents in that region who have already been through a rough stretch this year, I know a forecast like this can bring back some understandably tense memories. It's exactly why we keep such a close eye on every single update, rather than just glancing at one forecast run and calling it done. Small shifts in a storm's track, even ones that look minor on a map, can end up meaning the difference between a system passing safely offshore and a direct damaging impact. That's the entire reason continuous tracking matters so much with a storm this powerful. I know I've shown you plenty of those squiggly spaghetti model lines before, and yes, every single one of the major forecast models is generally in agreement on this general idea right now. Now, having tracked storms for a long time, I've absolutely seen tracks shift significantly with very little notice, so I'm not going to pretend this is locked in stone. But if anything does shift in a meaningful way, I'll get that update out to you with as much advance notice as I possibly can. Looking out toward the weekend by Sunday, the expectation remains that Dolphin sits to the northeast of the Mariana Islands, continuing on its approach toward the islands of Japan as we move further out in time. Let's talk wind field for a second, just so you get a real feel for how powerful this storm is shaping up to be, as Dolphin continues intensifying over the coming days. We're looking at a storm that is going to rapidly ramp up its wind field. The wind shear environment right now is fairly low, which unfortunately for anyone hoping this fizzles out, is exactly the kind of environment that's conducive to further development rather than working against it. So this storm really does have the potential to blow up in a hurry. We're talking about sustained winds potentially topping out somewhere north of 250 kilometers an hour, translating to somewhere in the neighborhood of 160, maybe even 165 miles an hour. That gives you a real sense of just how intense the system is shaping up to become. So we're going to keep watching this one very carefully as we move forward, and I've got you covered on all of it. To put those numbers in perspective, A storm with sustained winds in that range sits comfortably at the very top end of the Category 5 scale, the same tier that includes some of the most destructive tropical cyclones ever recorded anywhere on the planet. That doesn't automatically mean catastrophic damage somewhere specific, since so much depends on whether the storm's most intense core actually crosses land or stays out over open water. But it does mean this is a system worth taking seriously and continuing to track closely, regardless of exactly where that final track ends up pointing. Before we move away from Dolphin, I also want to take you over to the Bay of Bengal for a moment, because there's some separate development happening over there worth mentioning. Let's take a broader look across Asia first, though, because we try not to leave anyone out on this channel. Over toward Yap and Palau, we're watching some heavier rain, with pockets of that moisture continuing to lift up toward Hong Kong, and more rain expected there over the next couple of days. Up toward Luzon, there's a decent chance of rain showing up, especially further south toward Mindanao, particularly around the Davao area, where we could see some heavier pockets capable of producing meaningful rainfall totals. And once you lift back up toward Hong Kong itself, that rain looks fairly intense and active there as well. Pick basically any spot across Cambodia and into Vietnam right now, and you're looking at some sizable pockets of rain with a lot of moisture continuing to stream in across that whole region. It's worth remembering that all of this widespread rain isn't necessarily directly tied to Dolphin itself. A lot of it is simply the ordinary rhythm of the monsoon season across South and Southeast Asia, layering on top of whatever moisture Dolphin happens to be pulling in from a distance. When you get a storm this large and this powerful sitting out in the Western Pacific, it can subtly reshape the broader flow of moisture across an enormous stretch of the map, even in places thousands of kilometers away from the storm's actual center. Moving toward the end of the work week, by Friday, we're watching pockets of rain around Cebu, and there's a chance of catching a couple of showers as that moisture continues lifting up toward China. Taiwan is also worth watching closely, with increased rain expected there by Friday as well. And keeping an eye back over toward Guam, there's a small pocket of moisture sitting just off to the southeast that we'll be watching to see if it tries to develop into anything on its own, though obviously all the major attention right now remains squarely on Dolphin. Now, over toward the Bay of Bengal, there's a separate area of disturbed weather that's showing some early signs of organization. The tricky part with this particular system is timing. Even if a national weather agency in that region decides to officially classify it as a tropical depression or similar, it's likely going to run out of time before it can develop much further, since it looks to be moving inland fairly quickly once it does organize. That said, even without much wind intensification, this system is going to significantly enhance the chance of rain across the region. Most of the model guidance isn't showing this particular area intensifying all that much, even if it does end up getting an official classification from a local agency. The real story with this one is going to be the rainfall, not the wind. This is actually a pretty common pattern for systems that form close to a coastline rather than out over open ocean. A storm needs time and open water to properly organize and strengthen, and when a disturbance is already close enough to land that it starts interacting with the coast almost immediately, that process simply gets cut short. The storm essentially runs out of runway before it can build much of a wind field, even while it's still perfectly capable of wringing an enormous amount of moisture out of the atmosphere and dumping it on whatever land happens to be sitting underneath it. That's exactly the setup we're watching unfold here. Let me walk you through some 3-day rainfall totals across the region, covering today through Thursday. Out in the Western Pacific, coming out of the Central Pacific, that's obviously where Dolphin sits front and center. Beyond that, you can see a good deal of additional moisture building back toward Micronesia, along with heavier rains swinging back toward parts of China. Zooming in a bit closer, across parts of the Philippines, Manila could see spots topping out around 50 millimeters of rain over that 3-day window, with areas further south potentially seeing over 100 millimeters. Similar pockets are expected around Mindanao, with areas north of Davao potentially picking up somewhere around 100 millimeters of rain as well. These are genuinely substantial totals when you look at the broader map. Scattered rain is also possible back across the Mariana Islands themselves, including Tinian and Saipan, with a decent chance of some spots picking up around 50 millimeters, or roughly 2 inches, over that same 3-day stretch. Further west, the totals really climb once you swing up toward China. I mentioned Cambodia and parts of Thailand earlier, and across the southern sections of that region, we're looking at totals potentially topping 20 centimeters of rain, and that's just within the next 3 days alone. Taiwan, as I mentioned, will see its rain chances build even beyond that initial 3-day window, with things really ramping up once we hit Friday. Swinging back to China, particularly the southern provinces, including Hong Kong and areas further west, we're looking at totals potentially topping 250 millimeters of rain in some spots. Over in Japan, right now we're watching Honshu for the best chance of meaningful rainfall, with totals potentially reaching 150 millimeters or more, though obviously all eyes remain on exactly how close Dolphin ultimately tracks to Japan, and whether we end up seeing direct impacts there down the road. If you're subscribed, you'll get notified the moment there's a meaningful update on that front. Looking further west across Laos, we're expecting totals somewhere around 150 millimeters of rain. And circling back to that developing system in the Bay of Bengal, that moisture is building back toward India as well, with genuinely large rainfall totals expected there. Across central sections of India specifically, we're talking about spots potentially seeing 250 millimeters of rain, with some locations possibly topping 30 centimeters, raising a real risk of intense flooding in those areas. That kind of rainfall total, arriving over just a handful of days, is genuinely enough to overwhelm drainage systems in a lot of areas, particularly in low-lying or densely populated regions, where water simply doesn't have anywhere to go once the ground becomes fully saturated. This is exactly the kind of system that tends not to grab international headlines the way a major typhoon does, since it likely won't carry a dramatic name or reach hurricane-force winds. But the actual human impact from flooding like this can end up being just as serious, sometimes even more so, than the wind damage from a much flashier storm out in the Pacific. That's really the whole reason I wanted to make sure we covered it here alongside Dolphin, rather than letting it slip by unmentioned. So here's where things stand overall. We've got a lot happening across Asia simultaneously right now, and we're watching every bit of it closely, both what's unfolding in the Western Pacific with Dolphin, and this separate system building back toward the Bay of Bengal and South Asia. We want to make sure everyone across these regions gets the proper information they need. To sum up Dolphin specifically, it's a genuinely strong system right now, rapidly intensifying, and it's on track to reach super typhoon status in the days ahead. Based on current guidance, it should stay off to the northeast of Guam and the Northern Mariana Islands, which is genuinely good news for those specific islands, though we never wish a storm like this on anyone, wherever it ultimately ends up making landfall. If anything shifts regarding Guam or the Northern Marianas specifically, I'll get that update to you as quickly as possible. In the meantime, we'll keep watching closely as it approaches the broader Japan region further down the line, and we'll see exactly how that plays out. Ideally, we see some weakening trend develop as it approaches, though given how quickly the system has been intensifying, that's far from guaranteed. I also want to remind everyone that forecasts like this one are living documents, not fixed predictions carved in stone. Every single update from the official forecasting agencies gets refined as new data comes in, whether that's fresh satellite imagery, reconnaissance flights, or updated computer model runs. That's exactly why I keep coming back to this story day after day, rather than just posting one forecast and walking away from it. The picture with a storm like Dolphin genuinely changes, sometimes subtly and sometimes significantly, and the only way to stay properly informed is to keep checking back in as those changes happen. So that's everything I've got for you today on Dolphin and the broader weather picture across Asia. There's a lot of ground to cover, and I appreciate you sticking with me through all of it. Feel free to drop your questions in the comments, and thank you to everyone sharing these updates in group chats to help get accurate information out to the people who need it, whether that's about Dolphin specifically, or any of these other unnamed systems bringing significant rain and flooding risk to different parts of the region. I'll keep you posted as all of this continues to develop. Have a really good and safe day ahead.